Hello from all at the Men's Development Network and from the Engage National Men's Training Programme. My name is Lorcan Brennan and I'm the National Training and Development Officer here with the Men's Development Network. And I welcome you to our webinar here today, and I thank you for taking time to share with us, especially to mark International Men's Health Week, during a time that's really an exceptional time. Now, as we all know, this really is an exceptional time in our country, and across our country, many of us have been deeply impacted by COVID-19 and what's happening. So it's with that in mind as well, I suppose, that we step into International Men's Health Week and we mark it in a very special way. Challenging times also provide us, I think, with opportunities to be generous of spirit. And we all know that across Ireland for the last number of months, so many people have stepped into the breach to hold us and to mind us, and while standing apart, playing such an important role in relation to how we can mind ourselves through COVID-19. And many men, indeed, many young men, I know in my own community where I live, I've seen so many people who've stepped in to hold that space and to build social cohesion through volunteering and through being part of the response of restoring the balance of what we're talking about here today. So I suppose with that in mind, today's webinar is under the banner of restoring the balance and being part of the solution. And you see there on your slides at the moment, we have Men's Health Week, and it's our slide for the week that promotes it across our nation. And I would say to anybody who's watching here today, for more information around Men's Health Week, would you please go to mhfi.org, because it's a one-stop shop and everything you need to know about participating in the week and growing awareness and growing conversations on the island of Ireland about Men's Health Week. You will find it there under the drop-down banner of Men's Health Week 2020. We also have a man there called Colin Fowler, Colin at mhfi.org, and Colin will help you in any way that you would like to participate in the week. It's a virtual week, as you know, and you can go on there, and especially in relation to your social media platforms, you will find a lot of information where you can promote really good conversations around the themes of Men's Health Week for us. But today we're building on the back of a very successful webinar that ran on the 13th of March. And we had then Professor Alan White, who was with us, and Alan shared his experience of what he felt was happening across Europe and the world in relation to men's health and COVID-19. And today, you've seen it from your own invitation, there's a few things that we hope to do. The very first thing at our webinar, we hope to make a case for, I suppose, more explicit focus on sex and gender differences to inform public health and policy practice through COVID-19 and beyond. Secondly, we hope to look at the direct impact of COVID-19 on particular groups of men, and to look at especially, how we can respond to those needs in relation to those specific groups for a balance in their lives. And then finally, we're going to have an opportunity to explore maybe how COVID-19 has potentially been a catalyst for how we can look at men's lives and how we can explore it as an opportunity for reconfiguration of our roles in society. And to do that today, we have a couple of really good people here with us. One man you can't see, he's off screen at the moment, is my own colleague, Mark Can. But Mark is minding us today. He's also the Engage coordinator, the national program that we run. He's in there, but he's minding us on the webinar in relation to the virtual side of it. He's the whiz on tech, so he'll make sure we don't disappear anybody during this hour that we have together. Most importantly as well, there's our Mark there now, we also have Dr. Paula Carl and Dr. Noel Richardson, who will share with us their ideas and their understandings of where we're at under the lenses that I've just discussed in relation to men and COVID-19. Now, Dr. Paula and Dr. Noel are well known across Ireland. They've been so much part of all the initiatives that have been, I suppose, part of the flourishing, I hope, activities that have made up for men's health on the island of Ireland. They are co-authors of the National Men's Health Policy. They've been involved in many initiatives across the island, and they've also been involved in the poster here behind me, the program, the Engage National Men's Health Program, which is our training program that runs out nationally. So we're delighted to have them here today to share with us their wisdom and their understanding in relation to the issues that we're going to discuss. And we're going to do it very simply today. What we're going to do is really very simple. The very first thing we're going to do is we're going to invite Noel and Paula to share with us their slides. And then afterwards, we're going to invite you as participants especially to keep an eye on your chat bar and to use your chat bar to send us any observations or questions that can inform the discussion that we hope to have afterwards. And we hope that discussion will also be around further exploring how we can restore the balance to men's lives post-COVID COVID-19. Just to say as well, this is being recorded, so afterwards there will be an opportunity if people want to look back at it again, or we'll also have it to share with other people who couldn't make it here with us today. Finally, what we're going to do after our conversation, we'll have a sum up, and we'll have a final slide, and we'll have some takeaway points as well for people. So without any more ado, I'm going to ask, and I'm delighted to have him here and Paula, first Noel Richardson to please share with us his slides for our webinar. You're all welcome.
Right, good morning everyone, and thanks for joining us this morning. And thanks Lorcan for your words of wisdom to kick us off. And speaking of words of wisdom, I'm going to start this morning with a quotation from a recent article in The Lancet. And it reinforces what many of us in the area of men's health have been arguing for some time now, which is the need for a more explicit focus on sex and gender in health in order to create more effective and equitable policies and interventions. Now, the context of the article is the coronavirus, obviously, but this is something that makes perfect sense, I would argue, with or without a pandemic. And thankfully, Ireland has been very proactive in this space over the last number of years now with policy initiatives in both men's and women's health. So to have a focus on sex and gender is critically important to optimize public health and services and programs. Now, a key point in all of this is that I think if we've learned one thing from nearly over 10 years of men's health policy implementation in this country, it's that gender-sensitive approaches to public health is critically important to address health and social inequities experienced by more vulnerable population groups of men and women, for that matter. I think it's important to make that point. This webinar's focus on men should not imply that there is some sort of binary choice to be made between the needs of men's and women's health. Our position has always been that the needs of women and men must be met in a response that takes full account of sex and gender. But in the context of the webinar this morning, and it being Men's Health Week, what we can say almost for certain is that health inequities already experienced by more vulnerable groups of men are very likely to be exacerbated during COVID-19 pandemic. And we will come back to more tangible examples of this shortly. Now, there are lots of ways in which we could quantify health inequities, but one critically important approach is to examine premature mortality from conditions that are known as or classified as NCDs. These are non-communicable diseases such as cancers, cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases, and diabetes. And these typically account for a large proportion of overall mortality. And in recent months, we have heard a lot about the increased risk of more adverse outcomes from the coronavirus for individuals who have any of these as underlying conditions. Now, in this slide, it's a bit complicated, but I'll walk you through it. It talks about the probability of dying before the age of 70 from the 4 major NCDs, where the red dots correspond to female mortality and the blue dots corresponding to blue mortality. And it moves from high income to low income countries. So high income on the left, low income on the right. And what we see obviously is that males have a higher risk of dying before the age of 70 from these 4 NCDs than females do. But what's even a lot more significant is the slope of the graph. For females, we see that the graph slopes up quite gradually, whereas for males, it's initially gradually, but then there's this kind of sudden and dramatic or exponential increase in the graph as we move from high to low income countries. So what this tells us is that the risk of dying before the age of 70 in more well-off countries is about 10 or 15%, whereas in the least well-off countries, it's 35 to 40%, so it's 3 or 4 times higher. Clearly, therefore, it's not so much a question of male-female differences that are important here, but rather differences between men in different countries. And also we should acknowledge between different population groups of men within the same country, even though this slide doesn't capture that. So very often we get I guess hooked or bogged down on male-female differences in health outcomes or mortality or life expectancy. But a much more critically important approach is to consider differences between different subpopulation groups of men. So not surprisingly, therefore, this has resulted in a much higher proportion of deaths among confirmed cases in men than women for the coronavirus. So this is WHO Global Health 50/50 data, where anything above 1 represents a higher chance of dying from the coronavirus for males versus compared to females. And overall, while the incidence of the coronavirus has been more or less similar for males and females, approximately 57% of deaths worldwide have been male. Again, in our previous webinar, Alan White spoke a lot about, or gave us examples of sex and gender differences linked to these statistics. So sex differences, for example, include differences in immunological response between males and females, the protective effect of, say, estrogen in terms of a hormonal response, whereas gender differences capture things like lifestyle behaviors, delayed help seeking, differences in hand washing and other kind of hygiene practices which tend to be lower for males. But of course, it's not just about sex or gender differences. We know that this aggregated data masks the vulnerability of certain groups. So, for example, in England and Wales, black males are more than 4 times more likely to die from the coronavirus than whites are. Similar figures can be found in the United States. So, reflecting back on our previous slide, we should be asking the question, what is it about the intersection of gender and other social determinants of health, such as education, social class, race, housing, etc., that put certain population groups of men at such a disproportionate risk of adverse outcomes from COVID-19? So within an Irish context then, who are these vulnerable groups? And this slide just gives you a flavour of some of the headlines in recent weeks that draw attention to the fact that the coronavirus has had its most damaging effects within specific vulnerable population or occupational groups. And this doesn't do justice to all the groups, I'm just putting out a flavour here. And if you consider just for a moment 2 of these groups, if you look at, say, meat factory workers and care workers, it's clear that the factors underpinning their vulnerability during the pandemic are highly gendered. So apart from the obvious fact that both occupation groups are almost predominantly or exclusively males and females respectively, the common denominator here is that both are low-income groups, frequently on temporary work contracts, typically with limited entitlements or benefits, often living or working in crowded or cramped conditions. And yet it wasn't until their plight reached crisis proportions that they began to be noticed in terms of COVID-19 responses. So in the spirit of restoring the balance that Lorcan talked about, which is the theme of the webinar today, we would do well to prioritise the needs of more vulnerable groups by considering how gender intersects with other socio-demographic characteristics to predispose these groups to increased risk. So in summary, what I'm saying here is that yes, it's critically important to account for sex and gender in public health policy and practice during times of a pandemic and not. But it is more important to do so within the context of intersectionality. And by that I mean to examine how sex and gender interact with race, social class, ethnicity, education, housing, and so on, in order to target resources and public health responses to where they are most needed, and to ensure that during times of crisis like now, health inequities are not further exacerbated. So Paul, I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks a million, Noel. What I'm going to do over the next few slides is build on that foundation that Noel has set out there and speak about some of the indirect impacts that COVID-19 is having on men's health, but indeed population health, because much of the data available to us isn't actually disaggregated for sex. And I'm going to be presenting some data that has been reported. So in other words, what we know has happened as a result of COVID-19, but some researchers have used this data and developed models to predict what will happen should these trends continue. So I would just like to put a little caveat that latter predictive data should be reviewed with some degree of caution, because if there's anything I personally have learned from this experience is that certainty is fragile. So Noel, if you wouldn't mind moving the slide on there for me. One of the first areas I'd like to talk about is cancer in terms of the diagnosis, treatment, and predicted excess mortality as a result of COVID-19. So Noel, if you wouldn't mind moving it on, please. The data that you can see here is reported from Dietetics and is data reported from the US. And as you can see, it has been reported that there's been a significant reduction in the diagnosis of a number of forms of cancer that are presented here, from lung to colorectal to ovarian and breast cancer, as well as leukemia. And these reductions in diagnosis are anywhere from about 8.5% to 31%. And notably in this paper, they said that while this data is specific to the US, it is probable that the trends can be replicated elsewhere. And there are two major factors influencing why diagnosis levels are down. First, which we've all heard about in this country, is that fewer people are actually presenting for testing. So therefore, there are actually fewer biopsies to be tested. And the second thing is that, as again has happened in Ireland, a number of the laboratories that would be used for testing these biopsies have actually been repurposed and are tailored now towards COVID-19 tests. And both of these factors is having a significant impact on the number of individuals who are being diagnosed with cancer. The data then in orange that you can see is from the UK, and what we know from Cancer Research UK is that the treatment for a number of forms of cancer has also been impacted as a result of COVID-19. And comparing treatment statistics compared to last year and previous years, we know that there's in the region of 12,500 fewer surgeries, 6,000 fewer chemotherapy treatments, and about 2,500 fewer radiotherapy treatments. And if you look at the final two columns in both of these graphs, effectively what researchers have done from University College London is they have taken the reduction in diagnosis coupled with the reduction in treatments, and they are estimating the impact that this is going to have on excess cancer mortality should this trend continue. And as you can see, they are predicting that there will be an estimated cancer death toll due to this pandemic in the region of 18,000 people in the UK and in the region of about 34,000 people in the US. And again, this is based upon a continuation of these trends. While we don't have this specific data for Ireland, Noel, if you wouldn't mind moving on there, what we do know from the Irish Cancer Society is that GP referrals have dropped. So here you can see for lung cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, and pigmented skin lesions, there's anything from 50 to 73% reductions in e-referrals from GPs. We have heard our CMO asking people to use our hospitals and not stay away from services for non-COVID related issues, because there are serious implications for this, because if the trend in underdiagnosis and the lack of treatment for cancer specifically, it will most likely result in an increase in cancer mortality should these trends continue. Noel, would you like to move on there, please? I'd also like to say just a little bit about unemployment. You know, we've chosen specific areas to speak of the indirect impacts of COVID. And I think unemployment is really important for two reasons. First of all, we are hearing of an impending COVID-related global recession that has already resulted in significant job losses across the world. While we've yet to get clarity about what the unemployment level will be in this country, because it won't become evident, I think, until the social welfare payment changes to that happen. But there is an abundance of evidence over the last several decades documenting the detrimental effect of recessions on unemployment and population health. So I think it is worth looking at. And the second reason why I think it's relevant for this webinar is because we know that paid employment is so closely linked with identity, purpose, and meaning in many men's lives, and that the loss of paid employment can be particularly damaging to men for this reason. And as you can see from this particular slide, it's a group of researchers in Stanford University in the US, that have looked at the COVID-19 unemployment data and developed a model to predict its impact on mortality. And according to their model, they're predicting an increase in all-cause mortality in the region of 66,000, of which 9,700 will be due to suicides. We don't have to go too far back in Ireland to look at the impact of recession specifically on death by suicide in this country. And the data that I've presented here is from the CSO, and it shows the average number of deaths by suicide in the years 2003 to 2008, that's the data in blue, and I'm comparing that then to the average number of deaths by suicide in the years preceding that 2008 recession, so 2009, 2011. So what you'll see here, if you go to the final set of columns, is that sorry Noel, if you just go back one please, is that there was an increase at a population level in suicide as a result of the last recession in this country. But if you look at the male-female data, you'll see that actually the population increase was actually driven by an increase in male suicide in the region of about 14%. Just give me one moment, though. So while the data is not definitive, I think this is certainly worth considering, as a similar pattern might be likely unless there is an appropriate intervention to either, halt the recession or support men appropriately through it if what people are predicting does come. Thanks, Noel. If you move on there, please. And we do have some insight into the impact of COVID-19 on the mental health of people in Ireland. The data that's here is from staff at Maynooth, Trinity and 2 colleges in the UK that have surveyed a representative sample of the Irish population. They looked at the level of meaningful mental health problems in the population, and the data that's presented here, as you can see, is for loneliness, major depression, generalized anxiety and post-traumatic stress. What's in red is the data that they found for men, and in blue it is for women. And as you can see, across all 4 of these variables, the prevalence of these conditions is significant. There's one in particular I just want to give a couple of moments to, and that is loneliness. Because what we know is that, I suppose, 2 factors here is many people struggle to identify the experience of loneliness in their lives. And we know that actually for men, there's an emerging body of evidence that says that loneliness can actually manifest as an expression of anger, frustration, and violence. And, there are some very interesting studies coming out of the US that have actually supported men to recognize that actually the void and the behavior is actually a manifestation of loneliness. And the second thing about this particular variable is that it is generally very difficult for most of us to actually admit that we are lonely. We live in a group conscious culture, and it is a very overt expression of vulnerability that we can interpret as meaning there is something wrong with us. What is wrong with me? Why am I lonely? Why do I not fit into this group? Or why do I not belong? So as I look at the data that's presented here for both men and women, I would personally question it to some degree as to whether it might even be an underrepresentation of the actual experience that people are having. And loneliness as a prolonged, severe experience really has an absolutely detrimental effect on one's quality of life and also longevity. So I suppose just in summary of this data, while the data that I have presented here is concerning, it is worth noting that when we went into the last crisis that faced this country back in 2008, the National Men's Health Policy was only just published. And it is fair to say that the resources available to us at that time to support men was limited. But we're not starting from that place now. And Noel, if you wouldn't mind moving on to my last slide, please. 12 years later, we do have a solid foundation from which to respond to the needs of men and to begin to restore the balance that the COVID-19 currently presents. in all of the work that we have done over the last 12 years, a partnership work has really been the cornerstone. And I think National Men's Health Week is a really good example of that. 12 years ago, it was the Men's Health Forum of Ireland taking the charge with very few others around the table. This week, there's approximately 75 partners who are part of the planning and implementation and, you know, advertising and promoting Men's Health Week in a way that is really, really, I suppose powerful is the word. You know, I'm personally this week have been getting messages from so many different sources that it is National Men's Health Week and all of the different things that can be done. And this did not happen 12 years ago. Because of the base that we were starting with back then, the generation of knowledge and transferring that knowledge into actual tangible interventions was a really, really particular thing that we focused on. We wanted to understand specific men's health issues and understand the factors that affected that change so that we could continually learn from what we were doing and that all that we would be doing is evidence-based. That informed much of the capacity building that has happened, and Lorcan referred to our National Engaged Training Programme. 6 modules have been integrated, and we have in the region of 70 trainers and approximately 1,200 frontline service providers who have met a one-day training in men's health throughout this country, who are advocates and in a position to respond to this crisis. And we also have a number of national structures through which we can deliver interventions and services. The men's sheds, there are hundreds of them around the country through which services such as Sheds for Life are being delivered. We have the GAA Healthy Clubs model, again with hubs in every community in the country. And some of you may have heard of the Men on the Move community-based physical activity programme, which is being rolled out nationally as of the latter part of last year. So I think it's really important that we, first of all, are really aware of the tools that we have in our toolbox as we face into this crisis, and that we are not starting from where we were back in 2008. And now I'm going to hand you back to Noel to speak about some about what we've learned from this crisis that we can bring with us to inform our response.
Thanks, Paula. Yeah, just building on that kind of really solid policy base that Paula's talked about, and going back to the title of the webinar, which is about restoring the balance and being part of the solution. These are some of our reflections really on what we might begin to look at as we move out of COVID-19. Because in a way it is an opportunity to take stock, to reflect, to recalibrate, to reassess for all of us. And for some of us, we've been, I guess, shocked into changing our routines and patterns because of the coronavirus. But maybe that's not a bad thing. So these are some of the thoughts we have. The first point is about reconfiguring men's roles beyond that of economic entities. Our president talks a lot about this over the years, and it's something that I really enjoy hearing him speak about. But there is something really important in this, and as Paula mentioned, during times of recession, where there's job losses, there are huge ripple effects on men's lives. The tip of the iceberg is an increase in suicide rates, but that masks a lot of other really significant impacts on men's lives, on their mental health, on their relationships, on their sense of self-worth, and their sense of identity. What we know from the suicide literature and the mental health literature is that the extent to which men define their sense of self-worth based around their job, or about them as economic entities, the greater their fall, the greater their loss during times of recession, or particularly if they lose their jobs. So I think it is really important for us to think about this and to think about restoring some kind of balance in men's lives. And that really is in the second point, men finding this notion of a third space, finding meaning and purpose in their lives beyond that of employment, ensuring they have more balance in their lives should work be lost as they move out of retirement. And a really good tangible example of this is our men's sheds, where mainly older men find a renewed sense of purpose and meaning by learning new skills, by being in the company of other men, and very often coming from a place of, as Paula talked about, loneliness or isolation, and finding new connections and new meanings in the sheds. And this is a model I think that we should really look at carefully in terms of what we can learn from the model, and in terms of broadening out this to possibly other spheres, and including a lot more men. Another key thing, and it's really important in the context of how men can contribute to gender equality, it's to do with a reconfiguration of men's roles at home to assume more caring and domestic roles. And very often, efforts at gender equality focus on one sex for good reason, for obvious reasons, really. They focus on trying to look at ways in which more equality can be achieved for women. But really, if we're to achieve true equality, we need to look at how we reconfigure men's or women's and men's roles. And without men assuming more responsibility for more caring and domestic roles in the home, equality cannot be really fully achieved. One thing that we've witnessed throughout the pandemic is the increase in volunteerism. The GA, for example, have been to the fore, helping out people living on their own, delivering meals, checking in on older people. There's been a fantastic sense of community spirit, this restoration of mehel or community spirit that maybe we've lost a little bit over the last number of years. So I think COVID is an opportunity for us to take stock and to reassess about the importance of community spirit in giving back and volunteering. And this is important for people who are vulnerable, but it's also important for people who are doing the volunteering in terms of their sense of self-worth and identity. And the last point there is, for some, the COVID-19 has been an opportunity to kind of take stock and to take a step back and to reassess what's important in life, excuse me, and to take a step back from the rat race. So these are just some suggestions that we have that Lark and Paul and I discussed over the last couple of weeks. And we hope it might prompt some further discussion now, maybe some Q&As that might follow. So on that note, Larkin, I'll hand back over to you.
And thank you so much, Paula and Noel, for that very comprehensive look at exactly what you said you were going to do on the tin in relation to the three lenses we wanted to look in through. And a lot of information there, and a lot of very challenging information there in the context of COVID-19. But as Noel has said, at this stage, if you have any questions, please do use your chat bar and send them in to us, and we'll bring them to Noel and Paula here in the next few moments as well. And Noel, just can I go back to you just for a moment, because when you were leading out on the slides, one of the first things you really highlighted quite clearly was that in relation to specific groups of men, it looks like, you know, there's the social determinants really strongly at play in the context of COVID and who it can impact as well in relation to the Irish models that you talked about. Could you just say a little bit more about that in the context of where you spoke about?
I mean, I think, you know, as I mentioned, like the critical thing, sometimes we get bogged down in looking at sex differences in resources or in health services or in programs. And really that misses a key point, which is to identify those subgroups of men or women who are more vulnerable and more susceptible, say, for example, during times of recession or during pandemics. So it's really important that we look beyond sex differences to look at how gender intersects with, as I mentioned, social class and other socio-demographics to put certain groups at increased risk. And the critical thing is how we respond. And if we could just mention a few current examples linked to men's health policy, I think, that are doing this very well. There's the Farmers of Hearts programme, where farmers are targeted in workplace settings, in co-ops, for example, in marts. They're provided with a health check. The more recent programme has offered follow-up interventions, say by a health coach or text messaging with repeat health checks. So this is a good example of targeting an at-risk group. I mean, cardiovascular disease in farmers is really high. Farmers don't have a great tradition, I guess, of being proactive about their health. But this tells us that when the approach is right, that farmers will engage and are engaging, really, really positively with the programme. Another example is Sheds for Life, a program, health promotion program that reaches men in sheds. And again, there are lots of people who will tell you that older men won't engage. Nothing could be further from the truth. When the approach is right and we adopt a targeted approach. Paula coordinated a really good program a couple of years ago that's being rolled out now throughout Ireland, called Men in the Move, a physical activity program for previously inactive or sedentary men. So these are just kind of some examples of tangible, clever responses targeting at-risk, so-called at-risk population groups, in this case of men, because we're talking about men's health policy, but that targets the social determinants of health. It doesn't just look at men, it looks at the context of men's lives, where they congregate, what they're likely to find acceptable or not, and developing targeted, gender-specific, gender-sensitive approaches.
Good. Thank you, Noel. Paula, can I just come to you for a moment before I go to the chat bar? You mentioned, I thought it was a lovely line you used, certainty is fragile. And your slides, if you don't mind me saying so, like you mind some of the modelling that you use to look back and look forward, some of the findings are quite stark in relation to what we feel maybe could be out ahead of us in relation to men's health, around the failure of diagnostics and, a delay in a lot of the systems that we have in, yet we do know from some of the models that you use, the predictions are probably fairly accurate.
Yeah, I'm obviously, I was really careful when I was actually looking at the specific sources because I was really mindful of what was being cited. So yes, if current trends in diagnosis and treatment continue, and if the current levels of unemployment, as was cited in the States, because they're particularly high, remain, then there would be certain probability that those particular predictions will materialize. And I think, in Ireland, our leaders are now telling us to use services. So, and really emphasizing that quite strongly so that we can actually book these trends, these diagnostic trends, because I think we need to. And I actually think this would be one of those specific gendered behaviors that could be really detrimental for men because, they tend to delay help seeking anyway, never mind a pandemic that's keeping them out of hospitals and services. And as a result, they tend to present late in the course of an illness. So, if this pandemic is delaying that further, then I think in terms of our messaging, then I think it's really important that we send clear messages to men that they really do need to have their symptoms, checked so that the diagnosis can happen and the treatments can happen. Because unfortunately, I do think that if trends continue, then those predictions are probable.
Okay. And you also mentioned, I thought it was very interesting, paid employment is linked to purpose and meaning for men's lives, and that loneliness is such a particular part of so many men's lives and could be post-COVID as well. Are we having enough conversations in relation to even that point? That was a really important point, I think.
This is my personal opinion. I haven't, in my own line of work, found myself having many conversations about loneliness with colleagues. They might be happening in other rooms that I haven't found, but it's certainly an area that I've begun to read an awful lot about, and I'm starting to see it actually, even in some of the data from studies that I'm involved in. And it's been called a void. There's something missing. I knew I needed to do something. And, others who have written in this area have said that loneliness masquerades as many different things. And I do think that that's some of what I'm starting to see in the data. And I think it's quite important that we look at ways in which we can, I suppose, support men to recognize and that might be their experience and how they can be supported to socially reconnect with others. And just on the point that Noel made about the level of volunteerism, there's been a wonderful number of studies around, supporting people to get meaning and purpose in their lives and support them to move out of places of loneliness. And they've actually found that even 2 hours a week of giving, giving freely to something that someone is interested in, adds a huge benefit to their quality of life, and in actually taking them from a place of loneliness that is detrimental for their health. And it isn't relevant, it doesn't have to be a very specific thing that they're doing, like, I don't know, going down to a nursing home or whatever. All that actually matters is that it's something that they enjoy, and it's done freely with a spirit of kindness. And I just think that is beautiful. It doesn't have to be, 20 hours of something absolutely incredible to save the world. Just 2 hours a week of something you freely do out of a spirit of kindness for another human being can be really quite powerful in restoring that connection and bringing people out of loneliness. And I think many people have supported themselves through this crisis by volunteering and doing just that, finding a purpose, finding a meaning at a time of crisis, and help them keep their feet on the ground when everything else is moving around them.
Paul, have you lost Lorcan?
I think we might have lost Lorcan. I hope we can bring him back at some point.
The chat function there.
I might take over the questions then, if need be.
That's great, Mark.
While we get him in. So we've had quite a number of comments so far, but there's been three questions that have been asked specifically, nice and short. So we might take them in that round. Do you think that there have been any benefits for men's health during the COVID-19? That's from Albert. There is another one from Neve, which is, when was the Maynooth University study carried out? And then another one from Paul O'Kane, who says, how are men's shed funded in the Republic of Ireland? Now, there are a number of comments. I'm just kind of catching up with them, and we might go through them in a while. But I'll leave you
Maybe
up
I start with the benefits, Paula.
Pardon?
I might start with the benefits question, the benefits of COVID-19. I mean, it's in a way, it might be disingenuous to suggest that there are benefits at a time of, unprecedented stress and trauma in people's lives. But I guess in the spirit of the question, we could interpret that in terms of indirect ways that people, and men in this case, maybe have had to think about their lives, along the lines I spoke about in the last slide, reconfiguring roles and priorities, and taking stock of work-life balance, time to do other things, to have that meaning beyond work, for example. So I do think it's a very good question in that sense, in that it has maybe forced some people to recalibrate and take stock of their work-life balance, to find other outlets that give them purpose and meaning and a sense of self-worth. And it certainly thrown up opportunities for people, as Paula talked about there, to volunteer and give something back to communities. And we've seen huge increases and really positive examples of this. But of course, it's not for a minute to take from the real hardship and trauma that the pandemic has and will continue to cause through ripple effects with recession and unemployment in the years ahead.
I might actually just add to that, because I think that, up until I suppose the last year, 18 months, any kind of paternity leave was really limited in this country. So there are many, many fathers out there who got possibly 2 weeks at the time of their child's birth. And many of those men found themselves at home for a 6-week period during that, particular lockdown. So I suppose much of what my own reflections are actually personal. I have not found any data on this. And I do know through conversations and from what I have observed as well, that, fathers having that space at home with their children to be involved in their education, playtime, everything that relationship involves. An awful lot of men in this country never got that through a paid paternity leave that some men are entitled to now at this point. So I think that has been wonderful, I think, for some men that I personally would have known about. And I know it also presented challenges for families who found themselves in situations that they weren't in before either. So yeah, in the spirit of the question that was asked, I really do think that there have been benefits, particularly for those who have been able to enjoy them and haven't been directly affected by COVID. Hi, Laura.
Paul, do you want to take the Maynooth question?
Yes, yeah. So the Maynooth, that particular study, there are sequential surveys. My understanding is that's what's going to be happening. The data I presented is based on the 31st of March. The study was repeated on the 5th of May, but I have not been able to find that data. And my understanding is there's going to be other time points, but you can find the study at the both Maynooth and Trinity websites if you want more details.
And the question then on the funding for men's sheds. I know funding is always a challenge for the sheds. I know Michael Ring's department has given a small amount of funding for individual sheds to buy, say, equipment, linked to the activities that they engage in the shed. And the Irish Men's Shed Association gets some funding from different government departments to have that kind of coordinating role for sheds in Ireland. And the HSE certainly is one of the funders, particularly for the Sheds for Life programme, the programme I mentioned earlier. So I think there is some funding available, but there isn't a blanket funding for all sheds or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So there are a number of, there's quite a lot of comments coming in, and I just encourage attendees, if they can, rather than just messaging their comments to all panelists, if they want to do it to all panelists and attendees, because there's some really excellent points being made. I know Andy has two major elements about the traveller thing, and I'll get to that in a minute, but I'll just give, there's, I think, been 3 more questions since, and that is, along with lots of comments. There certainly was quite a bit of a comment from Nicola, who had said that need to look at younger men and review their roles about becoming carers, joining sheds, and that it's okay to take on domestic roles, not to wait until they retire to take stock of their lives. And kind of in related to that, Albert had a question saying how to reach out to younger men to set good examples. Have you any thoughts on that? Of course, Engage, Unit 6, connecting with young men could be the answer there, free advertising, but that's one question. Is there an urgent need for a men's advocacy group funded and recognised by the government, asked David. And then there's also a move towards more online counselling provision. Would that be a positive step in relation to the delayed help seeking that we have witnessed, and I suppose the kind of services that people can access? Would that be a positive step, asked Barbara? I'll let you tackle them while I kind of try and, I suppose, condense some of the comments. Some wonderful comments coming in.
Paul, would like to kick off there again?
Yeah, sorry if you don't mind. That
was on young men. Just a couple of points, Mark. You mentioned there is a specific Engaging Young Men national training program that's been rolled out now for the last number of years. There's a paper published just very recently on the evaluation of that program. It's in the Journal of Men's Social and Community Health. It's online. So that program is designed to support service providers to more effectively engage with young men around mental health, but more broadly as well. That's really important. I think that in the broader context of that question, the questioner is absolutely right. The earlier we can intervene with reconfiguring behaviours and the value that men place in their health, the better. So we know, say, from the health promotion literature, that habits that develop early in life tend to be difficult to shift in later life. So if you develop good habits, that's a good thing, because you retain good habits into middle and older age. So if we're trying to reconfigure men's roles in terms of caring responsibilities and domestic chores in the home, that's something that needs to be targeted early. And there's a host of different programs targeting young men that involves sport or music or different kind of hooks to engage young men around mental health. But we probably don't have time to go into all of those in the webinar.
Yeah, I suppose just one of the things to say, you know, that the men's sheds, you know, have been a real success in terms of, you know, providing that third space for men in which to find meaning and purpose within their own communities. And so many give back to their communities. So they have that other piece as well. Not only do they have a sense of belonging with a group of people, but they're connected to their wider community in this, you know, freely giving and serving a community. So there's a tremendous amount for men to gain in those spaces. And as the question, I think, referred to, more older men, you know, 50 plus men tend to veer towards the sheds. And, you know, how can, I suppose, mentoring programs, even something to bring younger men who aren't moving towards retirement or maybe in that kind of headspace might actually avail of that wonderful space without, I suppose, infringing on the wonderful dynamic that's there. But I do know that, you know, some of those sheds in Australia did look at kind of mentoring and bringing younger men in and that skills development. Yeah, because I know that, you know, while there's been fabulous programs out there for lots of young men, and, you know, many young men, you know, would be attracted by sports and physical activity type programs, you know, others, you know, might really appeal to them to actually work with their hands and learn and be mentored by older, wiser heads. So I think that connection would be really great if it could happen. Yeah, because there's a fabulous resource there that could be built upon, I think.
And I welcome myself back in, and sorry, I had a fuse that plugged that fuse on me here. I had to plug in again, so the virtual world came home to visit very briefly. So apologies for that, but I'm back up and going again. I just see just one of the questions in here, and it highlights the fact that, you know, COVID-19 especially has probably shifted the conversation for us in relation to mental health for men. It is seen as probably in relation to mental fitness and not just mental illness. Would you agree with that? There's a broader conversation in relation to mental health. All right.
Well, absolutely. And I suppose one of the areas that, you know, I've learned about in the last few years is this notion of flourishing, you know, because when we talk about mental health, we generally are speaking about mental illness. And you saw the slide, it's where I went to myself, you know, depression and, you know, post-traumatic stress. But this notion of flourishing and actually fulfilling our potential, because an awful lot of people don't find themselves maybe in that area, you know, of the mental health spectrum, and yet are not flourishing, and they tend to get missed, I think. And I think a big part of human flourishing is being able to connect with ourselves and one another and with our environment, and, you know, looking for opportunities in which we can actually support people to do that, I think would underpin such flourishing. Yeah. But it does, I think it needs to, you know, stand apart, and there needs to be a narrative that's consistently, you know, saying that while people don't require those particular services around mental health, they do require something else to support them to flourish. And where might that happen for men?
I think, Lorcan, the term mental fitness might have a particular appeal for younger men. We had a question about younger men earlier. You know, something that you can work on, like physical fitness. You can improve your mental fitness by spending time working on certain skills and things you can take control of and try and do when you're well. And it also speaks to, you know, mental health being something that you shouldn't just think about when you're feeling down or feeling upset. You know, having a mental illness is something we should all be conscious of and taking control of insofar as we can, and making choices that complement or help our mental health and mental fitness insofar as is possible. And again, notwithstanding the circumstances differ for every individual, and there can be huge demands on people's lives, as we've spoken about earlier.
Just I'm conscious we're coming into the last 5 minutes. Noel, going back to, we did talk about social determinants earlier on. We talked about the occupational classes, people who might be more at risk in the gig economy, and people who are unemployed. I'd see, like, you know, it's coming up there on the bar as well in relation to certain groups of men, traveller men or whatever. Do you think we're going to be, or we are serious enough about laying out our stall, or are we only at the beginning of laying out our stall of how we're going to approach the next steps into the real recovery in relation to post-COVID-19? And just I suppose the question is as well, a part of that is it just about the economic model, or is there something much more needed that maybe we've learned from going through this COVID time?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lorcan, and it's a complex question. I deliberately highlighted the case of meat factory workers and care workers, frontline care workers earlier, because I think COVID-19 has shone a light on vulnerable groups that we previously didn't really pay much attention to, and we ignored, and we assumed, they were invisible really, I guess. So if it's taught us one thing, it's taught us to understand and be more empathetic and sensitive to the needs of more vulnerable groups in society, and how their vulnerability is a function of the things we talked about: gender, social class, etc., etc. Because to respond to their needs requires quite a nuanced, holistic approach. It's not a question of a simple solution. The factors underpinning their vulnerability are complex and do require targeted investment and very particular approaches to engage. So I think that's something that we can take from COVID-19, being more sensitive and being more in tune with the needs of more vulnerable groups. And in the overall context of the question, then I think good public health does address the social determinants of health. Because if we're developing programs that are only addressing the needs of what we call the worried well, then we're doing something fundamentally wrong. We need to get out of our comfort zone and look at what groups in society require interventions the most, and what's the best configuration of practice that will enable us to reach those groups.
And Paula, for just a summary yourself, is there anything for us to take away today, if you were to leave us with a summary of what we should go from here, from this webinar, marking International Men's Health Week and Restoring the Balance, being part of the solution?
Actually, I'm going to refer all three of us to our last slide, actually, because I think it's there. I think, we have had conversations over the last number of days about how a number of things are required actually to restore this balance. And while, we spoke about this image, and while it might look somewhat unsteady, it actually requires every part of this to work synchronistically in order to restore this balance. Not one thing alone is going to support men through this. I think the community and voluntary sector have a really important role to play, given what we know of how men and where men like to use services and how they're presented to them. And I think, again, we've talked about things like sheds and Men in the Move. I think they're really good examples of how men are engaging with that sector. We need leadership through policy, definitely, and as Noel has been talking about, gender-sensitive policy that really supports a public health approach that tackles the inequities that many men experience. And I do think a lot of service providers, Engage evolved out of the need of service providers going into the last crisis, that they felt ill-equipped to face or manage some of the issues that men were presenting with. So I do think there's an onus on us to continue to support service providers to build capacity around these issues, and to continue to work with our partners across a number of different sectors. And I think the partnership bit is really important, because men's health work can often be quite lonely and isolating as a practitioner, and we need to support each other in this work. And the last bit I would say is that I think it's really important for all of us to know that some of the most effective work that has happened with men have happened in community-based settings. They don't necessarily come to where we want them to come to. We need to go to where they feel safe. And I read one of the comments that came from somebody who talked about men's sheds and said, what do you make in a men's shed? We make each other happy. Isn't that beautiful? Like, so when people come together where they feel safe, remarkable things can happen. And I think as service providers, you know, and public health practitioners, we need to go there to ensure that we create opportunities for them to be happy.
Look, it's a lovely note to leave our webinar on, and a word of thanks to Paula and Noel and to Mark, who's been minding our tech. It was my fault that I disappeared and the fusing of the plug, but it's all about reappearing. Remember that. We must keep turning up every day of our lives into the future. Thank you to all our participants who've shared in this time with us, building community, building learning communities, learning together online. It is so important. And again, a final word for International Men's Health Week. For more information, please do go to mhfi.org or contact Colin at mhfi.org, and he will give you any information that you need to know. Thank you for being with us. Mind yourselves as you go. We're in this together. We can make a difference together, and we look forward to being with you, listening to you, and talking with you again. Thank you very, very much.